Hey. Nice to see everybody here. So my name is Belinda Edmondson. I am one of the organizers for the Sawyer Seminar series here at Rutgers-Newark. The Sawyer Seminar is a series of seminars dedicated to exploring race, immigration, and inequality in the United States. So far we've had 3 seminars, and this is our 4th seminar. And this seminar is dedicated to looking at Black citizenship, that is, looking at Black people, both native-born and immigrant, and the communities they form, their politics, their religious communities. So we're very excited about this one. We have a great roster of people who are speaking. We really are interested in hearing what the audience thinks, particularly our students. So speak up, ask lots of questions. We're going to leave lots of space for questions. We also have books available, 3 books from many of our esteemed panelists. So please help yourself to one. We also have breakfast, and we're going to have some lunch afterwards. So we're going to feed you. We're going to give you books. We want you to ask questions. So this is going to be a good time. So welcome. I would like to bring up our esteemed Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences here at Rutgers-Newark, Dr. Jacqueline Mattis, to introduce our first panel. Good morning.
Oh, good morning. Excellent. I want to start by expressing my thanks to Belinda, to the organizers of the Sawyer seminar, and to all of you for coming out to make this a wonderful and what I imagine will be a really generative conversation and a really generative day. When I was asked to first give a couple of words and then introduce the speakers, I was tremendously excited, both because of who our speakers are. I've had the pleasure of reading Claudia Rankine's work since I was in graduate school. And that work was really transformative for me. And Salamishah Tillet is one of my favorite humans on the planet. And so just the opportunity to be part of this conversation or to introduce our speakers is one that I really treasure. So I'm going to start with just a couple of words and then introduce the speakers. The theme of Black citizenship is both timely and important to me personally and nationally. 20 years ago this year, I became a citizen of the United States. And I recall 4 things about that journey to citizenship. I remember the long debates I had with myself and with my family about whether or not I was going to apply for citizenship. Because I knew that it would mean giving up my passport, to some degree, giving up my identity, my legal relationship to the nation in which I was born. I recall purchasing the study guides and studying for weeks for written and oral exams to become a citizen, asking citizens the same questions I was being asked to memorize answers to, and realizing that many of the people who were born in this country did not know the answers to the questions I was required to know in order to become a citizen. I found that ironic. I remember that my former department chair, Eric Berman, a Marxist Jew from Queens, New York, would become a really important and loving member of my extended family while I was in graduate school, took the day off from work to take me to my citizenship exam. He drove me from Ann Arbor to Detroit, and he was the first person to hug me when I emerged from the exam with a smile, having been told that I had passed. What stood out for me was the hours-long conversations that Eric and I had about the complexities of our mutual identities and our distinct identities and the complexities of becoming a citizen. We talked about his own family's efforts to navigate anti-Semitism, their commitments to civil rights struggles, our shared and different immigration journeys, and I was profoundly aware of the privileges and precarities of each of our positions. He was born here. He would always be a citizen. This is always going to be his legal home. Our gendered, racial, ethnic, and class identities as people who were about to be a citizen, and he who was born into this place, meant that we had different journeys into what it would mean to be American. Those moments 2 decades ago and the millions of unnamed moments in between signal for me the complexity of citizenship generally and Black citizenship in general. In a legal sense, there are 2 key pathways, at least in America, to being a citizen: birth or naturalization. But the conversation about citizenship is more than a legal conversation. It is also a conversation about the individual and the communal. It's a conversation about the existential, the relational, the sociopolitical, spiritual, and historical meanings of what it is to belong to a place. Citizenship requires us to grapple with identities, belonging, obligations. It's a legal reality, but it goes beyond the individual. To be a citizen means to be a part of a community, sometimes to be a part of a community that did not contemplate your existence. When I was sworn in, the judge, who is himself a child of immigrants from Europe, took pains to remind us about our responsibilities to our new land and about the conditions under which this privilege of citizenship could be revoked. There was a lot of conversations about how we could be deported. He reminded us that we were required to fight for our new nation, that henceforth being American was and would forever be the site of our allegiance. The proud and well-meaning justice spoke in detail about our obligations to America, but he never once articulated America's obligations to us. He did not tell us that in this new bidirectional relationship, our nation has an obligation to care for, educate, remember, protect, not harm, to recognize, to uplift, honor our dignity and our humanity, and to honor our voices. He didn't say that citizenship is not about conferred identity. He didn't say that citizenship requires labor or that it is the product of labor. He didn't say that the work of citizenship is a work of constantly sorting out the possibilities, the obligations, and the varieties of one's identity. Citizens belong to their nation, but they do the daily work of making and remaking their nations. A conscious citizenry is aware of what the state can ask or require of them, but they are ever aware that all nations are built on failed and kept promises, on myths, aspirations, expectations, and inconsistencies. Conscious citizens know that a nation is not a static thing. Nations are like the people in them, always in the process of being made. Black citizens are in particular citizens of a nation that is rooted in our scientific, artistic, and aesthetic genius. Although we live in a nation that has yet to contemplate or embrace the fullness of our humanity, our activism, our protest, our spirituality, our humanity, all of these things about us have powerfully shaped the moral footings of this place that we call America and that we call home. Black citizens know the challenges of building a nation that will sing our songs but erase our voice. Black citizens know the complexity of loving a nation that does not always love us back, of fulfilling obligations and constructing hope and interrogating the meaning of an aspirational script on which this nation is built, of holding up a mirror to our nation even when our nation does not want to be seen. It is because of these aspects of what it means to be a citizen that I look forward to this conversation today. So give me a moment to introduce our 2 speakers. Salamishah Tillet is a scholar, writer, and activist. She was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2022 for her work as a contributing critic at large for the New York Times, where she's been writing since 2015. She was also a recipient of the 2022 Women in Media Award, excuse me. She's the author of In Search of the Color Purple, The Story of an American Masterpiece, and Sites of Slavery, Citizenship and Racial Democracy in Post-Civil Rights Imagination. She was a co-host and co-producer of Because of Anita podcast with Cindy Lee. I think I'm pronouncing her name properly, hopefully I am. Because of Anita won the Webby and Gracie Awards. She was awarded the 2020 Whiting Foundation Creative Nonfiction Fellowship for her cultural memoir, All the Rage, Mississippi Goddamn and the World, Nina Simone Made. In May, she was named 2021 recipient of the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship for her next project, In Lieu of the Law, Me Too and the Politics of Justice, the cultural history of the world's largest social media movement. She is the Henry Rutgers Professor of Creative Writing and African-American, or newly named Africana Studies Program, and the Executive Director of Express Newark, where we are today. With her sister Shahrazad Tillet, she founded A Long Walk Home, an arts organization that empowers young people to end violence against girls and women. And she received her bachelor's degree in English and African American Studies and graduated Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania. Claudia Rankine is the recipient of the 2016 MacArthur Fellowship. She authored 5 collections of poetry, 2 plays, including Provenance of Beauty, a South Bronx travelogue, and is the editor of several anthologies, including The Racial Imaginary, Writers on Race in the Life of the Mind. She also co-produces a video series, The Situation, along with John Lucas, and is the founder of the Open Letter Project, Race and the Creative Imagination. She has won numerous awards, including the Poets and Writers Jackson Poetry Prize and fellowships from the Lannan Foundation and the National Endowment of the Arts. Her book, Citizen, An American Lyric, which was published in 2014, won several awards, including the 2015 Forward Prize for Best Collection, the National Book Critics Circle Award for Poetry. It was also it was the only book that was nominated in 2 different categories. She has received the NAACP Image Award, the Penn Open Book Prize, and a number of prizes that, if I named them off, we would be here forever. Among her numerous awards and honors, though, she is the recipient of the Bobbitt National Prize for Poetry and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation. She is a faculty member at NYU in the Creative Writing Arts program, and she lives in New York City. So with that, I will invite our 2 speakers to the podium. Go to the
It's okay, oh, that's the podium and the mic. So I have some of your books, but not all of your books. I'll put them here. Well, thank you for this invitation, Belinda. Thank you, Jackie, for a nice introduction. Thank you, Claudia, for being with us today.
Such an honor to be here with you. And I, Dina, I had that same experience. I became a citizen around when, because I didn't want to become a citizen because I'm a Virgo, and I thought, you know, maybe I'll move to, I had this feeling like Jamaica would somehow be honored by Britain and be a part of the EU. And then I could live anywhere in Europe I want. But that didn't happen. Then I became.
Well, I want to say you were the last interview I did before the pandemic. So your play Help, which was restaged last year, but it was supposed to be March of 2020 or February of 2020. So I had the honor of meeting you then and witnessing the rehearsal. So every once in a while, I think all of us have this experience. There's like an encounter that you had right before the world radically changed. And then you have a reminder of that old moment. And so this is, and then there's something that's both healing and haunting about that. So I just want to say, you know, nice to see you again. We survived. There's a lot in between. So, well, I want to start actually with Jamaica. And I was thinking about this notion, these different notions of citizenship. So I think you came to the US when you were 8, is that correct?
7
or 8. And I moved from the US to Trinidad when I was 8. And so I was thinking of how, for me, going to a Black and brown country, leaving the United States, kind of opened up spaces of possibility, wonder, like just on the most basic like currency, when you can see someone who looks like you. And then the whole, you know, the country is radically different than the United States. I was curious for you, though, coming from Jamaica to New York with your parents, how did that encounter, how did that past of what was possible in Jamaica maybe shape how you understood citizenship as a young child and maybe today, before we get to the big citizenship of what everyone often has read already?
So you went over.
I lived from Boston to Trinidad for 3 years and then moved to New Jersey.
I came with my brother, my mother and brother had come ahead of us by about 3 years. And I came in a summer dress. And there was this, and this is really the only memory I have. It's true. I'm on the plane, there's a white stewardess. She takes off her sweater and she gives it to me and she tells me I'm gonna need it. But the funny thing about that sweater is it's an eyelid sweater. So it has holes in it.
It's not that warm.
As far as somehow very important detail. And I get to the United States and my mother, and again, this is the only thing I remember, told me, number one, do not trust white people. This was her message to a new immigrant. And that I was going to go to public school, but only for a little while because this immigrant woman who had come to the United States, that was her umbrella of knowledge that she was going to give to her daughter.
And then coming here and being a racial minority after being in a predominantly Black country that's post-colonial, of course, but how was that? Was that in terms of notions of citizenship or belonging? How was that jarring? Your mom gave you that advice. You had the sweater, and then you walking in the world. Was it a jarring, or was it? What was your early transition?
I eventually went to Roman Catholic school, and you're in this world of these white nuns, basically, and they were very brutal. And not just to color, to everybody, to the white kids, to white kids. These women, I don't know, oppressed sexually or what, but they were out to, they literally would punch the kid. And I remember sitting there as a kid and thinking it was a good education in not investing too much authority in adults. Because you could see a kind of psychic disconnect and a lack of justice, a lack of compassion in this room. And so those are sort of my memories.
Yeah. And then I read that you didn't start writing until you were in college, but I was curious, is that true, writing poetry? But what were if you had creative practices before that as like a child or an adolescent, what was the kind of imaginary world that you were in before you realized that writing may be the form that you want to express?
I think throughout high school, I came from a very, I'm really interested in what happened in those 3 years for you, where you came back. Because I came from a family where our father was, he's a Black guy, he's come to the United States, he's working as an orderly, and he comes home and he's incredibly violent. So the women in the house, my sister, myself, my mother, and my brothers, I think as a kid, you're still in power dynamic. And everybody has to negotiate this rate that's happening. So that dynamic sort of ended up eclipsing, I think, what would have been a kind of natural creativity. But what I did do is read, because my mother was, she was like, I will do anything for your information. I mean, she was one of those West Indian. And so I would go to the library and pick out 1,000 books. Literally, I'd come home with bags of books. And I'd say to my mother, I have to read these for class. And she'd be like, oh, okay. So she would let me stay up to book one because I said I had to read them. I had said, I just want to read them. She would have been like, no. But because I had to read them for class. And so I just worked my way. I read all of Hemingway. I don't know what I was taking in, but and I read the odd thing because of the way the library was structured. They had a series called The Best American Plays in 1941, 1942, 1943, and I read them. And then you would watch the 4 o'clock movie, and it would be the same thing you'd read. So the movies were coming from like. My brother would always say, how do you know the plot? But that was. And what about you?
My trip. So my sister, she's across the street giving a talk at JPAC. So, but if you were here, we went to Trinidad together. Well, it was interesting when you talked about the school because I went to pretty experimental schools in Boston. So I went to kind of like a Commonwealth Day school, and then I went to a Black nationalist or Afrocentric school. And then I went to Trinidad. And so the British system was really quite jarring for me because we didn't have corporal punishment. I mean, it sounds like you guys did at your Catholic school, but yeah, but in general, I had not been exposed to that in the United States. And so the disciplining and the punishment, I think actually, whether it's both Catholic and British or colonial, probably the convergence of the two. So that was really surprising and shocking and painful at times. I didn't have the teacher who was Miss Redhead, who we would hear her whipping girls as a form of punishment. But I did take lessons with her on the Saturdays, but there was no punishment. So I remember that this is an interesting kind of connection. I also think being an American in Trinidad, and then the process of becoming Trinidadian in the way that you probably you became American was kind of jarring, to say the least, just because there's a lot of capital attached to being American, obviously, but we were real outsiders, even though my dad's from Trinidad and my mom's from the United States. So there was a lot of cultural adjustment that needed to happen. But I think it just gave me a different vocabulary and vision of what the world could be, that the United States' racial dilemma and hierarchy isn't the only way that you can exist in the world. And that does something to a child. So when I came back to the United States, I felt very unprepared for American racism. I always feel like when I came back, and I went to a private school here in New Jersey, I just didn't have the armor that African Americans have to negotiate being in a predominantly white school environment. So that was I always felt like I was an immigrant, even though I was African American, and I had to learn how to survive as an African American. So by the time I left high school, I was, reading Malcolm X and Toni Morrison. But when I came in, I was quite bright-eyed and optimistic about race in a way that perhaps one does when they leave one country and come to another. So it's a mix, a lot of different things, but it sounds like when you came, your mom gave you that warning. So the optimism, you're both moving to a new country with possibility, but the optimism is contained within this racial paradigm. Is that when she says that to you, it must close off things, or what does it do?
Well, I think you begin to understand the story of the people who are in charge more complicated than it might seem.
Yeah.
As a child, you don't know perhaps the entire history of this, but you know that there's more to it than what you are experiencing. But then you put it up against the complications of the kind of violence in our home. And so in a scale of what's being negotiated, that takes preference, you know, that in terms of school becomes sort of a place where you might not be centered, but you are at rest because it's not as exposed to the non-things you're on. Is your right jab, but you know, so it was a mixed world. I can't say I would do that again. Yeah. Like, thank God we made it.
So then, with your first, like, well, I don't think, I feel like a lot of people know your more recent work and may not know your earlier work, but I do feel like it's beautiful to kind of go back to your earlier work and see the conversations you've been having with yourself in a way. And so in your first collection, I don't want to get the title wrong because it's a really beautiful title. You can say it if it'll take me 5. Nothing in nature is private. And I was just curious, like this moment, how did you discover, or what was that feeling like of becoming a writer? Like, was it a series of texts that you encountered that opened, was it a class you were in? What made you choose this? Or was it chosen, do you feel like it was already preordained? You know, some writers feel that way, that it chose them.
In college, I thought I was going to go to law school only because I was so concerned with justice.
Yeah. I thought I was going to go to law school as well.
There must be some justice. I am going to go help it happen. And that was obviously very personal in terms of our domestic situation. But I took a class, and I've said this many times. So now I begin to think that it is. I took a class at Williams. I was there, and I took a class, and in the reading list was Walden and also Adrian. And I read the poems by Adrian, and many of them had to do with patriarchy, with the inability, the difficulty of having conversations across gender. And I thought, you know, this work resonates with me, but I can do it better. And I did think that, and I only admit that because it's the kind of thing you think when you're 18. This renowned writer is lacking. And I, 18 years old, having not written a word, can do it better. And I did think it, but it was a good thing I did, because then I started trying and failing and failing. But that's how it started. I read those Adrian Rich poems and thought, they're almost right, but they're not right for me. And Ken McLean was at Williams. He teaches at Cornell, but he was at Williams that semester. And I took a class with him. And then and Louise Gluck became my sort of professor in writing. So I worked with her throughout with fisticuffs on, because our sensibility is exactly the same. But we managed to get through those years and remain friends. But then Williams was a predominantly white institution, and it meant that I wasn't exposed to a lot of things I feel my students are exposed to. And so I feel a little bit like what happened to you when your cousin, girlfriend?
Oh yeah, Nicole.
Nicole gave you those 3 books. That hadn't happened until I graduated. So I think I was a little behind on what was happening in the world of Black writing.
So I was reading in an interview, first of all, this is like amazing, Paris, review interview that you did years ago, that's just so wonderful, very rich,
That's
very-
David Mueller.
Yeah.
I love him.
yeah, it's such a good, and, I think in that interview, you talked about your kind of, your ambivalent relationship with Adrian Rich, and you say something to the fact that if I had Audrey, and I don't know if you mentioned you, but there were 3 Black women writers that you mentioned, how things would have been different, but since you didn't have them, this is the way that, so it was just, it made me think about genealogies and how we write ourselves into history, and your work is so much about engaging history and reminding us of the things that may get lost in history. So yeah, it was interesting to think about Adrian Rich, which was within that framework. And I think oftentimes, I was thinking about this today, I was reading an interview with another person, and this notion of genealogies, and sometimes I do think it's people, you have Baldwin and Adrian Rich, right? And someone like Baldwin has Henry James, right? So that there are ways in which we think that the genealogy goes one way, and then we talk to the writers, or we actually look at their bookshelves, and it's a really so palimpsestic, but it's also so global, and often maybe you wouldn't expect it. So it's kind of, I always want students to know that read as broadly as possible, both to understand the writers that you're interested in, but understand who they're in conversation. So read Adrian Rich as well as read Sawyer and read James Baldwin, which I'll get to with Baldwin with it sounds like, well, maybe we can get there too. I mean, you have the Adrian Rich, the poet, and then Baldwin, was it the essay or was it the novel or all of
was
it?
the
Yes.
essays. But maybe you can see this guy,
Yeah,
he was talking about, I mean, Baldwin then and now is somebody who knows everything all the time,
yeah.
from before and in the future.
Uh,
You know, like every time you read the number, like, oh, he said it already. So his work was different from Richard's. It was more, the social team of the United States, which was doing one thing, but her work gave me permission to feel like I could express a more personal.
I was thinking about Nothing in Nature is Private, and this notion of the personal. And for me, what I always find interesting about Baldwin, and I'm curious for you, is his ability in paragraph to paragraph to go from the personal to a kind of geopolitical statement, back to the personal, then this macro. And it's just a hard move as a writer to be able to be so big and small at once. But you didn't necessarily read it the same way as Adrian Rich is giving you permission to be personal. So is that fair to say that even with Baldwin making those moves, it didn't feel as interior for you as Rich? Or?
Well, I think because Baldwin's fight seemed like a fight, where Rich's struggle was one to be able to speak where there was no platform. You know, I can't even go back to Williams and say, why didn't you give me Audrey Lorde, or why didn't you give me? Because, you know, I went to Williams right like a few years after they were letting women into. So we were just at that moment.
Yeah.
You know, so there were a bunch of white women teaching other white women. And I can't really fault them for that because the doors had just been opened. And that idea of feeling like you could speak about it was very different from what I was taking. You know, and Baldwin has, in some ways, I would say, if the two of them lined up, Rich has receded and Baldwin has come forward in their importance because I had to be able to feel like I could speak before I could engage the sort of huge issue. role that it's taken on. I mean, I think if I were like you, well, not you, but you know, so much of the Alice Walker to you. You know, I think that is located in the Black family, in issues that encircle your own life. And so those issues allow you want to go into the text and into your life. And I didn't have that same.
Yeah, that makes sense. What you were saying, I'm doing this project on Nina Simone, who was very good friends with Baldwin. And that was like that line you just had about he knows the before and the futures. Is how I talk about her too. So it's like they were obviously good friends for a reason. But also trying to, I think I'm just obsessed with genealogies because of the way that I came through African American studies, both at Penn with Barrett Griffin, and then I went to Harvard with Skip Gates, and they're just really into a tradition of something of African American literature. And so once you're taught that, then you're kind of figuring your way, well, where do you fit into this tradition? And for all of you all, where do you fit into the tradition that Claudia is part of, but also providing us a new lens into understanding. I was curious that one of the things that, you know, when you talked about reading the plays and then watching the television show, and this notion of like for you early on, you had an intertextual relationship between the visual and the literary. And we can see in your work that there's an increasing, and now by the time we get to Just Us and Citizen, we're like fully in the visual and the literary or the written and the image. But what was that process like for you? I know with the plot, you were slowly getting there. Was it always something that you wanted to experiment with, or over time you felt like you had to, you know, it's a question of form, but it's also the opening up of form for you. What led you to having these really like dynamic relationships with the word and the image?
You know, I think the development of my own creative life had a lot to do with people. I don't always talk about, but people like Beckett and Salon. I went at first because I felt, I mean, I didn't feel, I was traumatized. I went first to the realm of trauma. And in that realm, the places I ended up were with people like Shoshana Feldman and Paul Salon and looking and Shoah and Claude Lenz and Beckett, because the question was, how do you bring the language of pain out without being stuck in the actual story, and put it in the landscape as a thing that is functioning all the time for all of us on different levels, so that people are talking to you, but what they're telling you is in a way irrelevant. What they're expressing is what's important. And so I became really interested in how do you do that? How do you say it? How do you say it without being caught in the narrative? I mean, in some ways you could say that Alice Walker's fight with the culture was, I'm going to show the thing and I'm going to say it. And people were like, you can't show the thing. You can say whatever you want, but you can't show it. And at least Black men were having that feeling. And so I thought, I don't want to get distracted showing because it is that thing that we will struggle with throughout our entire lives. It is that thing, the feeling of the thing, not the story of the thing.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of how we teach creative writing, I feel like, but yeah, like show, don't tell, but
So,
yes.
So theater for me became experimental theater, especially places like Beckett, where he was able to do an entire play with just a mouth. Or a rocking chair where a woman is just expressing her final moments into death, rocking them. Those things fascinate. So that, I think that's why eventually I was sort of interested in moving from the page into.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's very interesting. And then you talked about, well, you often talk about this, so this is not new, but that the seeds of Citizen were born in Hurricane Katrina,
Yeah.
witnessing the visual and listening to the way in which people like Barbara Bush talked about Black people who were suffering because of a natural and state disaster. Right? But then the book comes out in another moment in which Black Lives Matter. So it's like the book arrives at a moment when there's a movement that understands at least the intervention and the critiques that you're making. So you can't anticipate that, though in a Baldwin way, you're both of the past and imagining the future when you're writing it. So I was just curious for you, and this is a question you're often asked, so I don't want to, I'll let everyone else hear your answer. This relationship between the kind of lyric and citizen, this notion that there's a form that enables you to understand the particularities of American racism. Why was the lyric, or even though the book itself is multidisciplinary, but you name it as the American lyric, what's at stake in that title, I think, for you?
It has everything to do with my investment in affect and the power of feeling and the emotional life of all. And I feel that the reason I never left poetry as a genre, you know, a lot of writers started in poetry and then moved on. Nabokov, I could name many. But poetry for me is the realm of feeling. And even though Citizen came out of interviewing a lot of Black people, I didn't want to move into your genre. I wanted to stay where feeling mattered. I mean, you know, this panel is about citizenship. There is the reality of the lack of equal justice under the umbrella of we're all citizens. But we all know that the feeling of being approached by one in the hallway is different depending on who's standing out there. So I just think that I personally, as Claudia, want to stay with the unspoken, with the in the realm of what is not seen but felt. So
that makes sense. So, well, my first book, Sites of Slavery, I was really fascinated. Well, it was an undergrad and in grad school, really interested in why African Americans kept on returning to slavery as such an important subject in their world. So thank you. It's like so nice. I know like you read my stuff, but you integrated so nicely in the conversation. So thank you for that. But I was too interested in so the whole thesis is like, you know, there's legal citizenship, but we know what those parameters are. But there are other ways that people feel like they do or do not belong to a nation or to a people. And we don't often name that, talk about that, and it's hard to kind of codify. So I call it descriptive, you know, the feelings of belonging. It's the longing and the seeing yourself represented, and what happens when you don't feel like you're represented. All of that stuff kind of, you can't sue someone for, but it's still a form of discrimination. And I feel like this notion of feeling and citizenship is really important, and that you can raise our consciousness level to understand it in these really magnificent, but also kind of heart-wrenching ways in both Just Us and in Citizen. And so I was curious, and I read one review, and they're like, Claudia Rankine goes to lots of dinner parties. Yeah.
She should stop going to dinner.
Yeah, she's too many dinner parties. But really what
White person.
Yeah.
I just want to.
what I got from outside of the critique was that there are these, you illuminate these intimate encounters that Black people have in non-Black settings or in maybe interracial settings where 50 or but that you're showing us, and then you interview Black people and you kind of the narrator is you and not you, right? And so I find this notion of like, back to the Adrian Rich notion of like intimacy and how you stage intimacy, like what are racial encounters actually like on the most intimate level, or a dinner party, or sitting next to someone at an airport. All of these encounters that you stage for us really give us a new way of thinking about it. I think in sociology, they've got microaggressions, macroaggressions, but on the level of feeling, what does it mean to be cut in line or have your body constantly under surveillance? You're providing a new language for us and a new lens. So I think that's really important. And I think why we're in this moment today and having this conversation about citizenship. One of the things I want to thank you though for is your work on Serena Williams, because you were kind of seemingly the first person to really investigate the way in which her body has been under such scrutiny. And there was a interview I was reading with you. You talk about her being a kind of stand-in for all Black women's bodies. And so I wanted to talk about this kind of juxtaposition. One, you have Serena and the ways in which she's highly surveyed, under surveillance, and also required to be so excellent. And she's to stand up for Black women's bodies and Black women's role as like saving American democracy, right? And so is there a punishment that Black women experience at the same time that they're expected to save democracy with each presidential election? I'm just curious for you, the relationship between the Black woman's body and her ability to be citizen in the United States.
First, I'm going to say, move your mic.
Oh, okay, you can't hear me. Yeah. Thank you.
That's a great question. There's something I'm not coming in the front. One of the most important images for me the last couple of years, and I haven't written about it, but I want to write about it. I certainly think a lot about it. Is that image that went around on social media of Justice Jackson and her daughter? You know, that look the daughter had, like, I love her, so good. And it was a beautiful, beautiful image. And the reason I want to write about it is because, even though I haven't, is because it showed us who we exist for. You know, like, there she is. That's the most important. And she sees what her mama has done. So, and that it was out there, that, you know, we all got to share in that. It was a fantastic moment. And the reason I said I'm coming in the back row with that is that with Serena, I think a lot about how Black people have, not anymore, but we're allowing white people to set the gaze, to set what we value in ourselves and what we value. When you've written about Anita, and you know, and how that worked out for her.
And us as a nation. Yeah.
And so I think when I decided to write about Serena, I did it because I wanted to say, look, we all know equal is not equal. We all know citizen is not citizen. But, and I thought a lot about this, I was like, who can I use? Who to point this out? Who is out there? And I lived in Claremont, California, very Southern California, you know. And so there are lots of like white ladies in their seminar hanging out. And one day I was in a cafe and there were two white ladies and I was doing a little bit of judgment, sorry, about who they were. And they're chatting away about this thing and that thing and that thing. And then they say this thing. One of them says, so are you gonna go to mall? And the other one says, I can't meet you. All this much it's and I was, oh, y'all could be my friend. That she was functioning for everyone, not just for everyone. And that level of excellence was under attack by white people. And not just what she was doing, but who she was, what she did, what she said, how she moved. And so she kept going higher and higher and the attack. And I thought, if I use her, I can talk to her. And I don't have to then say anything that anybody has to take my word. They can go back, they can watch the match, they can find it on YouTube. You don't even have to have accents. You can just go to YouTube. And so that's why it ended up being fun, because I wanted someone who could just, and also Serena. She was fighting for everyone. I don't think this is a personal opinion. And maybe I don't have the right to say that, but sometimes when I see her out there with her daughter all the time, I feel like, she's still trying to prove it, like it's at what point will she be able to go into her life as Serena Williams and not feel like the world needs to know she is a great mom. But, so I think she is one of the most popular, and she grew up with it.
Yeah.
So you saw it as a teenager. 20.
Yeah, no, I feel like there's so many like battles that we could see her being embroiled in and her having to choose to participate in, just on the level of the body and fashion, high perform. I mean, I have a next project on me, so Serena, and so I was like, I'm kind of upset, and I was a kid athlete, so I was like, there's so much there with her and Venus, of course, but the childhood to adulthood and now the mother. So I guess I want to open it up to questions, so audience, but I just want to ask you one last question about the most recent book. The timing of your work is always so again prescient. So 2020 Justice comes out. I think, okay, because it's a double title.
And to
The Richard Pryor, so Just Us and Justice as the play there. So when did you start writing that? Were you writing that in 2018 or?
I think like you, that have done this, I write all the time, and
Did it come out of an essay that you?
yeah,
Okay.
and I'm supposed to write.
Okay. Oh, I see. Yours was a regular contributor. Okay.
But I don't do. But back then I thought I was supposed to actually be accountable for the fact that I'm. And so I was really interested in trying to think about what it meant that we would have to adjust to white supremacists in the White House.
Mhm.
And what it meant that I was moving around the world with these white men who had voted
Mm.
for this.
Mm.
And I was teaching at Yale at the time, and I was teaching classical constructions of whiteness and getting a lot of death threats.
Mm.
So really feeling like this is not a little thing. These people coming. This is going to be a game.
Mm.
And my students were interviewing their family members and finding out like their, great granddad, Nazi, And so I thought, why am I not talking to the people who are shaping or misshaping our democracy? And so that's when I decided I spent a lot of time at airports, I spent a lot of time in first class sitting there. It wouldn't work now because they put the pods up. So you don't actually sit next to me. But back then, the seats were like this. And so you would be on a plane for 8-10 hours. And right here was the guy who was fucking me over.
Mhm.
And I was not asking him why.
Mm.
Why are you voting for Trump? Do you know what he did? Are you living in a bag? And so I thought I would just start asking. And so then I did, and then I wrote the piece, and I knew I was supposed to end something time, so I was like, I don't think they're gonna publish this, but here. And they were like, no, go. And even if you look it up today, I think there are 1,000 from people, very angry people. And I got something like 200 letters addressed saying, "Dear Claudia Rankine, you don't know anything about white men. My life has been this." And that's when I realized we have no public discourse around talking about whiteness.
Mhm.
Everybody's happy to talk about Black people and Blackness and slavery and blah, 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 and this and anti-Semitism and anti-Asianness and anti-this, and anti-that. But nobody is comfortable talking about how white supremacy is controlling our democracy and shaping. And how white people, by their very whiteness, are benefiting from the beliefs that have come up through white supremacy. And how many Nazis were, there's a great book called Ebony and Ivory, where institutions like this one and Harvard and all were shaped by these people. So I sent it in and Jacqueline, and that led to Just Us.
Mm.
Because then publisher said, why don't you continue this over the course? But I didn't make up conversations. That's the only one where I was like, I'm gonna talk to you like it or not. All the other conversations in Just Us happened.
Mhm.
And then afterwards, I would say, oh, that conversation, you and I would have a conversation. 2 days later, I'm still thinking, I write it up. I call you. I say, I'm gonna write an essay about it. Okay.
Mm.
You say, okay. I hired a psychiatrist because I was interested in why I was also saying the things that I was saying. And why I was getting so upset about certain and not upset about others. So where's that? And then I hired a fact checker, very expensive endeavor. And then a lawyer, I didn't hire a lawyer, but she was kind of to look over the text. And so it went, and then I sent it back to you. And I said, if you think I have misrepresented our conversation, let me know. And would you write a response? And most people said, no, this is what I said and what you said, but it's not what I meant. And people who felt deeply about that wrote a response. Other people were like, no, this is what happened. Go forward. And which is easy because I don't use it.
Oh, thank you. And then that became the help too. And that's like, yeah. So lots of lives for that.
But help, the information and help came from the website, from the New York Times.
Oh, the comments section.
The comment section and from the letter section.
Yeah, yes.
So many of the things that the men say help.
Yeah.
Verbatim.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, well, thank you. I have so many more questions, but I'm going to stop and pull back my deep interest in continuing these to learn from you. Can we, is there like a microphone? Yes, there is, but it's hard. We have about 15 minutes for. Okay, Belinda, are you my time?
Can you hear me?
Oh, okay.
Hi. So can I do a quick the microphone demonstration?
Sure.
Okay. Hi everyone. So my name is Esperanza. If this is your I don't want to get too close. If this is your first time using a microphone, please be about 1 inch from your face so we can hear you clearly. And please don't be shy to ask a question. We are here for our education. And even if it sounds silly, or even if you think it's dumb, it's probably not. And we're invested in each other, and that's the kind of environment we want to build. I'm out of breath, geez. So feel free to ask questions. I'm just gonna, can y'all make your microphones a little bit closer to your face?
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just want to say to Esperanza publicly, they were my TA for our Black women's performance class, but it was right in fall of 2020. It's another pandemic. You were pre-pandemic, but that was a fully on. So it's always so nice to see you in person. So anyway, thank you. Okay, so I guess we have Q&A time. We have some time for questions. And you were given the directive, do not be shy.
While we're waiting for the question, I want to say something. I feel like when I refer to white people, I'm referring to the category thereof. I'm not referring to individual. Because all individuals have possibility of goodness and bad. But we can talk about whiteness and white people as part of this country in ways that have a kind of consistency.
And if you can say your name and where you claim, that would be good.
Hi, Belinda Edmondson. Thank you both so much
Where do
for
you
this
claim?
conversation.
Where do you claim? Where?
I claim New Jersey.
Not even.
I claim Jamaica. I claim. I have a question actually for Claudia and also for Salamishah. So you, Claudia, are a Black immigrant from Jamaica. Nobody really discusses your work as the work of a Black immigrant, but your creative life is about inscribing and articulating the Black US experience. and this is what our conversation has been about. But you are a Black immigrant. So I want to bring the conversation back to what it means to be a Black immigrant writing a Black US experience. One of the reasons why I'm thinking about this also, I'm thinking about a history in the United States of Black immigrants representing the Black US experience. I'm thinking of Sidney Poitier, Black Bahamian, who represents sort of an ideal Black US model, if you will, Harry Belafonte.
Happy birthday, Harry. Just had a birthday.
So I'm just wondering, I'm also thinking of more recently, the Black Jamaican writer Marlon James, who wrote a piece in the New York Times a few years ago saying that he knew that in order to be a writer, he had to leave Jamaica one way or another, in a coffin or on a plane. In a way suggesting that creativity happens here, which is very different from the way Black US writers have described their experience in the United States. In other words, Black immigrants have articulated that the United States is a place of possibility. Black US writers, I'm thinking of Richard Wright, about not being in the United States. I was wondering if you could speak to that, because again, our conversation has been about the Black US experience and your articulation of that. But you, as Dean Mattis said, you had to become American with all that confers.
Did you go back to Jamaica often as a child, or? Yeah, okay, I was just wondering, in terms of the.
Yeah, I am naturalized American. There's a reason why no one talks about that. I mean, we're good. I think it's because I've consciously made the decision not to talk about Jamaica, because I did not grow up culturally in that country, and so I don't have the reference that talk about signifying it and sort of cultural stability. I don't have that there. I have it here.
A little bit. I think we should.
I think she's on the phone. Yeah. That's an option.
She's up.
So I believe that we are, nature nurture. We are socialized into our position. And everything that I have read and that has made me happened here, even though my parents obviously came and there were influences, we listened to Bob Marley, we did all of that. I can't tell you sort of who all the trajectory of Jamaican history in the way I have American history. And so it felt irresponsible to speak to a culture I wasn't a part of, even though I am of it, obviously. But so is everybody else in this country of another culture, one way or another, even back generations. So that's why, in my case, it's not something that gets talked about, even though I think it is sometimes, I love it when people are like, the Jamaican writer, I'm like, yes and no, yes and no. My one favorite thing though about, if I were gonna write about something in Jamaica, it would be The Amazing Adventures of Mary Seacole. Have you guys read this book? You gotta read this book. It is the best story of a Black Jamaican woman going to London, fighting in the Crimean War, becoming a masseuse to Queen Victoria. I mean, who knew? Who knew that was possible?
I mean, to follow up to your question, Belinda, though, growing up in New York, I was thinking about this the other day with like, not to add to your list of people, it may seem like it's out of the box, but like Christopher Wallace, known as Notorious B.I.G., right? And so like being Jamaican, American, growing up in New York, and New York being a kind of special place that's both always Caribbean and African American. And I was just curious for you, is that, you know, New York is, you're from New York, so it's already a deeply Black cosmopolitan diasporic space. So you're pulling from that, but then you did move to a predominantly white neighborhood at one point, right? So
We grew up in a white neighborhood, but I think this is where trauma comes into that story. Because of what was going on in our family, there wasn't a lot of community in, you know, I think my mother was very, keep that door locked. So because if you have that much violence in your family, you don't really want people in your house. So there wasn't a lot of, you know, we weren't inside a Jamaican community. I was at school, I was at home. And so I could see, you know, in Marlon's case, I think the sort of homophobic, rampant homophobia in Jamaica is what prevents him feeling like it's a safe space for him to be a writer. But there are lots of other people who've worked from Jamaica and have produced for, you know, but certainly Marlon is completely justified in claiming that it's not good space for him. But yeah, I think that kind of, what do you call it? A kind of close shame. I think you call it shame. Shame. When, you know, like I think our mother did not want people in. And so we weren't allowed. It wasn't like we grew up in Brooklyn.
I see.
And we're going to the parade.
Yeah.
That there was very much a, we are here on our own.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions? Thoughts? Yes, over.
Where?
Thank you. Your name and where you claim.
Hi, my name is Keish Kim. I'm a postdoc with Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. I think is what I need to claim in this space. Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation and all the writings that you've been doing. I've been learning a lot from it. My question stems from Belinda's question that she just asked. I think listening to this, I think I study immigration and thinking about undocumented immigration is sort of where my scholarly investment is in. So when we are thinking about immigration and being naturalized and becoming a citizen, right, and especially in a racialized world, I think what Belinda's question raised for me is this moment of when does the dominant white culture or Americanness claim a Black immigrant into its citizenry or even its populace, right? While expediting deportation of Black undocumented immigrants at a rate that's significantly higher than any other immigrant population, right, or undocumented population. And I think, I guess my question is sort of around that of like, how do we, or how do people who have naturalized or people who pass or, you know, even pass as a Black citizen. I think I'm just wondering about this moment of incorporation and when it becomes successful or not, when there is an active erasure of undocumented Black immigrants who are being deported or detained, or their deportation is expedited. They're not even detained at a long term where Latinx populations are. So I guess I'm thinking even when we think about these artists who are immigrants or first gen or second gen and their migration experience is erased and their Blackness becomes more dominant, I think I'm just intrigued about that moment and what is productive for the American culture to claim, or I guess I'm just interested in that moment of incorporation. I don't know if you have any thoughts. It's not a fully thought out question, but it's a moment that's been sparking for me. Thank you.
I mean, I don't think city portiers, I actually don't think that they're, and Jim is behind, so he's in the world of city portier deeply, or Harry Belafonte. Like as a Caribbean American, African American, I see them always pulling on their island home. Like, I don't think it's like this rupture that you become African American culturally. You're just, it's assuming African American-ness is always Southern or urban, Northern, and not diasporic. So I would just say that was one thing. And then the other thing I think is like an interesting essay. This isn't get to your point, but John Jackson sent this to me a long time ago. Devin Barbato's essay on racial naturalization, and he talks about, there's the legal process of becoming a citizen as a Black immigrant, but then there's also the kind of social process of encountering American racism as what marks one as American. And so he details that. He's a law professor, right? And he's detailing it as this set of processes that Black immigrants go through to become American are these racist encounters they have with white people. Now, there's other ways you can talk about what it means to become African American, but that's one particular way that he writes about that I think is always kind of useful for us. I will like you.
I mean, I think what I'm hearing is that anti-Blackness will be encountered at every level. So it's going to be encountered at the border, in the processing, in the rejection, in the turn back, in the return. So even in that space of time that, say, Latinx are allowed to stay before being deported, that isn't graced by Black people. That I think is part of anti-Blackness, and it's so ingrained in this culture that it's an automatic. You just assume it's gonna. There was a senator who, when asked about the treatment of, in this case, Latinx kids at the border, he said, well, it's not like there are kids. Like, why should I answer that? And that is at the root of the othering of everyone outside of whiteness. So in the end, it all worked out.
Other questions? I think we have time for two more. Okay. There's one back there, and then. You don't see them. Okay, and there's one back there.
There's no good place. Okay, hi, I'm Pamela Council. I represent William. I represent Columbia. I represent survivors. So one question that's come up for me as I've started teaching, and I walked in just as you were talking about the trauma of Williams and how that made you agree.
I love William.
I mean, we all love Williams, and it makes us better artists, but it's complicated. So as I started teaching, one question that has come up for me is, how do you create a pedagogy that's more restorative and sort of integrates this work? So how do you approach teaching? I mean, we're seeing it here. How do you approach teaching in a way that restores some of these issues?
That's a great question when we're in a crisis of curriculum right now. Think about what's happening in Florida, when you think about what's happening in some of the red states. I feel that in my classroom, the benefit of my classroom right now is that the syllabus has things on it I wish I had read. And that allow, like, if I were 18 or 19, I feel as if I would have started at point S instead of point L. If I had been allowed to read Zon, if I understood what Norbesi Phillips was doing in a book about slavery that believes it's a story that cannot be told. And what does that mean in terms of the decisions you make as a writer, as a person who's thinking about history, and as a person who's thinking about slavery? And also, what does it mean to use slavery to talk about American life, now? So I think that is probably the other thing I always say to my class, and I think it has served, I've taught now for 30 years, is that whatever happens in the class gets resolved. And that has worked out really well in the class. Because it means when I leave, I'm not carrying anything with me. Thank you.
Good lesson first. I think there's someone back row wearing a yellow sweatshirt.
Williams to yellow, here we go.
My name is Jennifer, or I go by Geneva Mariko. My parents are immigrants. Basically I claim Malian and I'm American also, and Newark raised. One of my questions is like, what was your mother's thoughts on you being the first person to go to college? Because I'm the first generation. Me and my brother, my brother graduated already. And how did your knowledge help them throughout the years? Because I still help my parents stay uneducated. So sometimes that can be difficult. How did that transpire throughout the years? And also my dad actually did his citizenship like 2015, 2016. So that was kind of like a process while I went through helping him get his citizenship. Hope you guys can clearly.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, being first done. Well, my parents got their citizenship and I remember when it happened, but it wasn't because of me. It was because young lawyers came to the hospitals in the Bronx and made many West Indian, Caribbean people were working as orderlies and nurses' aid, and they set up and had them register for their citizenship. It was one of their sort of community projects. And so my parents got their citizenship before I did, because they only did it for the people who were in front of them. And so they couldn't do it for their kids. But in terms, my mom is a big reader. She was pretty well educated in Jamaica. And when I was in 3rd grade, I won the poetry prize, which is interesting because I didn't turn to poetry till college, but I won the poetry prize for this poem. I memorized it. Emily Dickinson. Because I could not stop for death, that's kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. We slowly drove, we knew no haste, and I had put away, etc., etc. And my mother taught me. And she taught me a whole bunch of poems, but I had forgotten. She taught me poems by Connie Cullen, and I only remember 3 years ago at Christmas when she started reciting it for some reason. So I don't have that same relationship to them in terms of bringing education to them, but in terms of opportunity, in terms of a kind of mobility in life, certainly they made my mobility possible, but they also hindered me other ways. So it's been a battle.
Wow, thank you so much. This has been a beautiful, but just a wonderful conversation.